We're excited to gather you all here today with the Collective for Radical Death Studies and talk a little bit about a topic that we don't normally talk about amongst this group. We typically deal with issues of sociology, anthropology, things of that nature. But of course, everything that we deal with is highly visual as well. So we wanted to open this up to some art historians and visual culture historians to talk about their work. And explore sort of, images of death, traumatic events, and the use of human remains in visual culture. The Q&A is open, so we welcome questions from the audience as well. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to introduce our panelists for today.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists and then let them tell everyone a little bit about their own work. So first, we have Belinda Q, who is a CCS postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley. Belinda, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about your current research?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm working on a book project, which is based on my dissertation right now. And it's called Expose and Punish, Trial by Moving Images in Revolutionary China and Beyond. So it's basically a history, a double history of trial as media and media as trial in the socialist context. But I trace back to some earlier periods in China in which technology of photography was introduced to China. And I also, I basically describe, I use a term of exposure or expose rather than spectatorship to describe the mode of human encounters with media, much more than just watching, and driven by the logic whereby people as one is only achievable via the appearance and the visibility of, so-called evil others. So it's kind of rooted in the global history of participatory media, and mass participation really played a key role. And the historical question I have been examining is to see how photographic and cinematic media and shaming punishment were intertwined in the very specific socialist context. But I dated the study back to 1920s until 1980s. And it's kind of, quite broad context, quite time span. But I try to dig into some more case studies and also from a comparative perspective. You may see the issue of how enemies are made has been more pressing, especially during the time as we see, divides are everywhere and violence has been enacted and reenacted everywhere and anytime. So I would say maybe this is a kind of pre-historical effort to see the roots of what we call the violence of cyberspace, cyberbullying, or the digital wars on terror. And I try to make some connections across time and border to see the potential possibility of approaching what we see violence or mass participation, how the two were at a play in intertwined ways. I guess, so I usually situate my work at the intersection of film and media study, art history, and the legal humanities. I have been always interested in how trials and punishment, what we can learn from the visual culture of that. And so in terms of death, I have been working with quite a few genres such as execution films, execution photographs, and also how human remains or the corpse are represented in different genres. and also across different historical periods. Sorry, I don't want to talk too much, but basically that's what I'm interested in. If I really need to conclude something, like with a central question my work centers on, that would be how does an image shame, or how does cinema punish? Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. Next, we'll move on to Mlondi Zondi. He is an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Center for the Humanities at Wesleyan University.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mlondi, and I'm working on a project tentatively titled Unmournable Void. And this project is focusing on contemporary Black artistic practices, both visual art and performance. And I'm interested in how these practices actually tend toward the dead and dying. And I'm interested in how these artists are thinking about sort of the transatlantic slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade, apartheid in South Africa, as well as African colonialism in general. But they're thinking about these systems of domination as not past, as not sort of, they're not memorializing them as past events. And instead, they focus on how these systems of domination are still with us. They remain in the present, although some of them have sort of transmogrified and look and feel different, but they are the same. So I'm interested in some of the sort of aesthetic tactics and motifs that they use to not to represent, but to name unrepresentable Black suffering and death, because they are very interested in these questions around the ethics of looking and the ethics of visualizing the Black dead, or visualizing the Black corpse, to be more specific. And another thing that I will add is my project is also, I'm interested in thinking about death itself as not a universal thing, not as a universal sort of finality after living a livable life. I'm arguing that for Blackness, a death is what precedes or anticipates the Black, such that what we know as Black life, as everyday Black life, is almost always entangled with death. It has a proximity to death. So when we talk about the dead in relation to Blackness, we're not ruling out the quote unquote living.
Thank you. And next we'll move on to Jessica Dandona, who's currently a professor of art history at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, where she teaches courses on art and empire, the body and art, and modernism.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm a little nervous in front of crowds, even virtual ones. So I've got my notes over here to the side, and you might see me looking at them. So I am about halfway through a book project called The Transparent Woman, Medical Visualities in Fin de Siècle Europe and the United States, 1880 to 1910. And it is a real, it's a kind of new departure for me. I am trained as an art historian who specializes in 19th century French art, but I'm shifting to looking at my subject kind of more internationally and really thinking about the medical, the history of medicine as a way into looking at these images as well. So the book examines images and objects that were used in the study and the teaching of anatomy at the end of the 19th century. And I'm interested in two things, both ways of looking and ways of seeing the biomedical body in this period, when medicine is kind of consolidating its professional authority, when it's coming to set the stage for what we know today as modern medicine. So the book examines anatomical models, textbook illustrations, photographs, teaching charts, all things that are used in the study of anatomy at the end of the 19th century. But I'm also interested in the body as object, whether that's the practice of anatomical dissection or the preparation, display, and study of anatomical preparations, or what we know as specimens. So I'm considering the circulation of things and bodies, and texts and images, and with that knowledge across national borders and between spaces variously coded in this period as professional, private, and popular. Today, I will mostly be talking about what is actually a relatively new element of the book and of my research, which is thinking specifically about human remains. I spent a wonderful sabbatical, 15 months, researching the material for the book. And I kind of got to the end and realized I'd had a really hard time the entire time looking at human remains and thinking deeply about them. It's as if my entire research was a process of dancing around what was really there at the core. So this is my effort to over the last few months, kind of think more deeply about how human remains are used for teaching in the museum and in popular contexts. So I'm considering also the spaces in which specimens were viewed. And these could include professional spaces like the classroom. They can include private spaces like doctors and anatomists' own private collections, sometimes housed in their homes. They can include the anatomy museum, meetings of professional societies, etc., as well as the way that these objects circulated in the form of photographs and wood engravings. One of the main questions that I'm interested in is how the process of creating anatomical preparations, as they were called in the 19th century, transforms what was once a living subject into something that is understood to be an object, what that transition looks like, and what kinds of consequences it has for the way we understand life and death and the subjects whose bodies provide these objects. So I would just like to take a very brief moment here to recognize some of the important work that's been done in this field, looking at the history of dissection, the cadaver trade, and the role of specimens in the Anatomy Museum. Writers like Ruth Richardson, Michael Sapple, Samuel Alberti, and Dana Ramey Berry, and others have done much to bring to light this history, which for a long time, really, up until maybe the 80s, early 90s, was a kind of hidden history, the history of specimens and their origin. What I hope to add to this discussion with my book is to really bring my perspective as an art historian who is attending, hopefully carefully, to the materiality of these objects, as well as the multiple cultural meanings that they carry. My time period is roughly about 1880 to 1910, and there's some really specific reasons for that. This is a period where there's a lot going on in terms of the medical profession, not only consolidating its authority, but medical curricula are being standardized and defined in ways that still impact how medicine is taught today. This is also an era when women are entering medical schools really for the first time in relatively large numbers, an era that's really interested also in pathology and defining the abnormal and the pathological, and through that, the normal. It's an era also of social anxiety, especially around the issue of reproduction and health and fitness of different national populations. And it is an era also characterized by the rapid diffusion of information and images, with texts crossing the ocean, being translated, being published in other countries within just a few months of originally appearing. So there's a lot of movement in this era, there's a lot of anxiety, and medicine as we know it is kind of taking shape in ways that will profoundly underwrite what we know of as medicine today. My work looks at a few case studies: Edinburgh, Philadelphia, and Paris as kind of centers for medical education and publishing in this period. But as I continue to work on this project, I'm looking hopefully outwards from there as well, to think also about how these practices, images, and kinds of knowledge are communicated to other parts of the world as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And our last panelist today is Maggie Hazard. She's a lecturer in art history at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Lake Forest College in Chicago, Illinois. Maggie, you're still on mute.
Thank you. There's got to be one of us that does that. So I'll take the hit. So my current research is based around the research that I did for my dissertation, which I am currently in the process of turning into a book project. My dissertation was called Weird Copies of Carnage, Marketing Civil War Photographs and the Public Experience of Death in the 19th Century North. And I looked and am looking very closely at the influence that photographs of the dead from the American Civil War in the 1860s, I'm looking at the influence that those photographs had on the way that death and mourning were understood and experienced in the Union, in the United States during that period of time, and also extending that conversation past that through the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. One of the kind of pivots of my research is the fact that this conflict was the first time that photographs of fallen soldiers were created and were specifically created to be marketed and sold. They were sold to the Northern public extensively by a number of different photographers, through catalogs, through advertisements in journals like Harper's Weekly, a journal of civilization. They were turned into woodcut prints and printed in Harper's Weekly. And so they become really an industry of their own in a lot of ways. And what's really interesting about that is that the photographers and the studios who are creating these images are actively marketing them as photographs of the dead. So one of the things that I argue in my research is that these photographs really did influence a much broader shift in the way that death is experienced in the 19th century and going forward. And it is one of the things that is helping to move from a very, very private experience into something that is much more public. And it really comes alongside the development of things like the funeral industry and things like that as well. My research really then pivots around not just the creation of the photographs, but also what is really the emergence of some of the first really truly mass media in the 19th century, with the explosion of illustrated journals like Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly was one of the most widely disseminated journals in the Union in the second half of the 19th century. And what that means for these photographs as they're being turned into prints is that they are able to reach an audience that is much, much larger than just New York City or Washington, D.C., where a lot of these photographers are centered. In fact, it can actually reach to some extent to the outer edges of the Union in some cases. And so my argument really is pivoting around the influence that these photographs then have, and also their extending life as they're turned into prints, as they are sold and resold, and then republished throughout the rest of the 19th century, throughout the 20th century. Today, we can actually find them in very large numbers in places like the Library of Congress and the digital files. So it's really centered around that continuing influence. One of the things that I'm really interested in continuing to look at is that my research is really demonstrating then the way that photographic images like this really can and do influence social and cultural norms in the United States as a beginning point, but then I'm also extending outside of that kind of small sphere, and I'm very interested in continuing to look at this from a more global perspective as well. Some of my the most recent connections that I'm making is kind of starting with those Civil War photographs is that I'm starting, as I'm also looking at photographs from the end of the 19th century, photographs, for example, of the victims of racialized lynching in the United States, extending even farther than that to the Vietnam War, to images of police brutality in the 21st century. And the reason that I'm doing that is that I am interested very much in drawing connections between photographs like this, these really traumatic, disturbing photographs from the 19th century, and the way that we consume similar, also traumatic images in the 20th century and even today. I'm also very interested in drawing connections between this industry that starts out as a relatively homogenized kind of industry in terms of the people that are being represented. When you look at these photographs, all of them, when you're looking at those photographs of death, they all include white soldiers. There are no soldiers of fallen Black soldiers, Indigenous soldiers. You don't see those. So I'm interested, but they very much serve as the beginning of that precedent for an influx of traumatic imagery. So I'm very interested in drawing the connections over time between those photographs from the 19th century and the way that we consume and understand photographs in all capacities today, and in a number of different ways. The other kind of additional element to my research is that is significant to my recent work is that those photographs also are the first time that we see the suppression of images as well, in the death of Abraham Lincoln first. And then that extends again through the 20th and the 21st century as we start to see instances of photographs that are suppressed really for the purpose of mediating a public message. And very often that then extends and translates into photographs of minority bodies and other and marginalized groups as well. And it really develops into, and you can start to see that there's a trajectory that develops that I am extremely interested in continuing to interrogate in a number of different platforms, first with my book project, but also more broadly than that as well. So.
Great, thank you. Clearly you can see we have a lot to talk about today, spanning multiple centuries and whatnot. But one thing that you all have in common is, again, dealing with this issue of trauma and human remains, violent deaths. And one of the questions that comes up for this is the question of ethics. And I think you all sort of have touched on this slightly, but I would like to turn the discussion a little bit first to Jessica and Belinda, and then have the other two join in as well. For Jessica, I'm really interested in you talking about some of the issues with copyright that you've had and the reproduction of images, especially for scholarly work, because I think that that's a question that we all need to think about. And Belinda, I know that you've been thinking a lot about trigger warnings and how to sort of prepare people for viewing these images and even hearing about them. So I'd like you two to sort of chime in on those topics and then hear from Maggie and Mlondi also about how the ethical question works into their work.
Sure, I'd be happy to start with that. So I have done my research so far. Paris is kind of the third stage, and the part that I've done the most with is here in the US and then also in the UK. My sabbatical was in Scotland, which in the 19th century was one of the kind of foremost training centers for medicine in the world. Students came to study medicine there from the colonies, from the United States, etc. And so what really struck me in the course of doing my research was the very different approaches that the US and I'm going to say Scotland in particular, because even though it's part of the UK, they have their own regulations because of the devolved status of Scotland. So there's a huge contrast in these two contexts around how human remains in museum collections are treated. So here in the US, we do have laws that govern organ donation and the process of bequeathing your body to a medical school, for example. And those are done on a state-by-state basis. So there isn't a federal human remains law. in the UK, both England and Wales and Scotland, they're two separate laws, have laws that regulate how human remains are used. And this requires licensing for institutions that deal in human remains, such as medical schools and anatomy museums. And the licensing is quite strict about how and when not only those remains themselves can be stored and used and displayed, but also about how images of them can be used. And so what you see is two really very different approaches to thinking about, in a sense, kind of what is owed those whose bodies are on display. I think if I were going to boil down kind of the basic issues, they really are around ideas of privacy. So thinking about what kinds of information is revealed by having one's remains on display, for example. Also, obviously, the large issue of consent, which in the period that I'm studying is basically absent from the record. Consent is not a concept that physicians have at this time. They believe, for the most part, that they own the property that they remove from cadavers or from patients that they treat. It's also then the issue around property and who owns these remains. And obviously for museums, that's tricky because of calls for repatriation of remains, which continue and I think are important, and but for museums can be a thorny problem. And then, there's the issue too of propriety. So even, for example, at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which displays human remains to the public for the price of a ticket. You can go in and see these 19th century specimens. Even though they're not operating under the same laws as in the UK, they very strictly limit photography by visitors, for example. It's not allowed. And if you're a researcher and you want to reproduce images of the collection, you have to go through a complicated process of permissions. And I think a lot of that boils down to the issue of propriety and thinking about how we can kind of ensure that remains are understood and viewed and treated in an appropriate way. But those ideas really go back a long time in terms of how at the end of the 19th century already, there were concerns about anatomy exhibitions being seen as potentially obscene or as providing inappropriate information to the public. And so you see already by the 1870s and 1880s, through obscenity laws in the UK in particular, this attempt to kind of limit who can see, who is allowed to see, and when and where. And so I think that kind of continues to inform perhaps the way that we understand these remains today.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate how you mentioned consent as something absent from the record in a specific period. And it's the same case in China as I examined the socialist context. So I would say in terms of how we understand the ethics of seeing death, part of my inquiry really is drawn on the convention of seeing justice done as, just so widely understood as a core of how we understand social justice in different periods. But I would say it really depends on how much we're allowed to see and to what extent the distribution of the so-called visible and the sensible is very limited in some cases. And I didn't get a chance to do that in our previous presentation at CNA. Is one example from the 1940s, wartime China, of female corpse laying on the ground, and then how for the Chinese Communist Party, as they really need to do to conduct projects around mass mobilization. And the discourse of exposure or the discourse of death was really radically shifted. So in Asian China, as people know, a crowd is never absent around the spectacle of death, but people are basically just watching without doing anything else. And that's part of the moral education, where how the authority is committed to convincing the popular masses understand what is being done here in the name of justice. But then in the 1940s, in that example I mentioned, people were not just there to watch. And one of the captions used for that photograph to show, so actually it's nameless. We are not allowed to see the woman's face. We are not allowed to know her identity. But what we do care, what we are compelled to care, is just to see the nameless violence being done there and death as a consequence. And then I remember very clearly from the archival collection, the caption associated with that photograph is, let's do our revenge for her, and let's do something in order to achieve the justice that she deserves, whoever she is. So it's something like the identity could be abstracted, and then people are mobilized to realize the nameless death actually entails a process of naming in the other way, which is in the name of the people. So I would say, without doing anything but just watching, that was, if we understand that as an older modes of watching or older ways of seeing, and then in the socialist discourse, it's supposed to be something more performative, which is, please do not just watch, but take action. You need to take action as so-called us, and then for them and also for everyone else. So that's why I think, while I describe my own study as a history of naming and shaming, to explain, to explore the role of images, how they play the role in the shaping and also changing modes of circulation around what we call maybe, the visual economy of death. But here, it's really about, without naming something, we are actually naming something greater or as a higher justice. So that's why I think, in terms of the ethical inquiries, how we understand the act of naming in relation to the image work, I think that's something important. As we know, it's also related to privacy. So based on my own experience, whenever I present, I try to be very careful about how much I show, because as part of the social tradition of shaming, people's name are shown on a board, being crossed as a way of shaming. And then, while sometimes we're not allowed to see more detailed information of a certain piece of material due to censorship or due to the loss of that, but we are always allowed in unexpected way to see people's personal information through this kind of photographs or film stills. So I need to be careful. Like sometimes I have to hide people's face because I got a personal case files from private collectors. That's what we call grassroots archives. Who knows, the person, the individual's family, what would they encounter or confront afterwards? And also, I need to hide some information within the image as well. Not just in terms of, the ethics of spectatorship, like how we see the cruelty, but also in terms of the legacy of their family history. I really don't know those people, where they live, what they are doing. And I don't know, through this kind of display, while it's in pedagogical context or scholarly context. So I don't know, just it came to my mind immediately when Kylie explained the question. So I think this this conversation could go on and on as we move forward to see how scholarship around death, specifically during the pandemic, and the pandemic is not done yet, and how we deal with those similar matters even nowadays. Yeah, I guess that's what I can share right now. But yeah, I would love to see how others think.
I can add a little bit here. So for the photographs that I look at, most largely the idea of ethics, it does come into play. And Jessica, I know you mentioned the idea of consent in images from the 19th century. And that's something that really is a consideration for me too, because as you mentioned, there really isn't a consent per se for images, photographs that are taken. The other thing that I encounter is the permissibility of display. Who has the right, so to speak, who has the authority to look at these images in the current context in the world today? Many of these photographs from the 19th century of the Civil War, the photographs of the fallen soldiers, as well as photographs of victims of lynchings, they're taken for a very specific purpose. And that purpose, although the initial impetus behind them obviously stays the same, that purpose for their existence does shift over time, and it affects the way that we consume them and the way that we understand them. The other thing that's really, I think, useful within this context to keep in mind is just the difference in the way that and the reason for the creation of these photographs. When, for example, you look at these photographs of fallen Civil War soldiers who have been killed in battle, as I mentioned in my in kind of overview, they are all white. You do not see minority soldiers of any other race or ethnicity depicted. And there are a number of arguments to be made for that. There are a number of reasons for that. But one of the effects of that is that all of those photographs are being made to be marketed and sold, yes. But there is also a kind of a dignity there to that representation. Although they are very often very candid, they're very raw, they are traumatizing when you look at some of them. There's still a kind of a humanity that is granted to those representations in the way that they are created, in the way that they are bought and sold. They are sold as a kind of memorial, in a sense, and a remembrance for this this terrible war. That is very different from the purpose behind photographs taken at the end of the 19th century of victims of lynching, which is something that, with the phenomenon of lynching, that as it develops at the end of the 19th century, this industry of photographs explodes. And to say it explodes is not an exaggeration, unfortunately. It develops into its own kind of industry that is solely based on the continuing suppression and denigration of Black people, right? Stemming from the reality of slavery, the end of slavery, and it becomes its own way of controlling the Black body and the existence of people who are part of a minority in the U.S. And we can go back to that because and kind of confirm that because of the way they are consumed. They are created to be bought and sold. These are not photographs that are just being documented as an archive. They are bought, they are sold, they're sent through the mail as postcards until 1908. And it is very much a confirmation of that white supremacist ideal that is very much a part of the culture of the 19th century. So the ethics of why these photographs are created in this period of time becomes ever more significant, and is perhaps even more significant today as we are continually realizing, admittedly, very belatedly on a cultural level, the impact of what these photographs were and what they did. So I think the way that they're consumed is really significant, and also the lack of consent. There is no such thing as consent in either of these categories, and certainly not when it comes to photographs of lynchings as well. And then again, that does also extend into the way that we consume things on social media as well, with instances of police brutality as well in the 21st century. So.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. And in responding to that question, I would first like to maybe mention some of the scholars that I'm in conversation with that deal specifically with that question. And I'm doing this because, I mean, whatever I say will not exhaust what can be said. In response to this question. So others can look at the work of Saidiya Hartman, specifically her first book, Scenes of Subjection. They can also look at David Marriott's On Black Men, and also Lee Rayford's book entitled Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare. And so to attend to your question, the artistic practices that I'm interested in, and the artists that I'm in conversation with are well aware of the difficulty of having to name unrepresentable death and suffering through representation or representation with a dash. I mean, and because they're already thinking about the challenges of that, what often happens is a lot of Black artists turn to abstraction and a lot of sort of non-representationalist approaches that are about not showing the dead body, for example, in a literal way. So they either blur the image, there are all these artistic motifs that they use, and where I understand that as naming the impossibility of representing unrepresentable death, but it is also naming the impossibility to completely, it's naming the impossibility to not represent or repeat the violence of spectacularizing death. So in my work, I look at these sort of abstract and non-representationalist practices that understand themselves as sort of paying rigorous and radical attention to avoiding this representation of death. And I'm arguing that those motifs also do not resolve the problem, because what often happens is that when you actually sit down and look at them, there's a lot of violence that is reinforced in those very same images, whose endeavor is to bypass violence. And then another thing I will say is, in terms of repatriation, there's this conversation, there has been this conversation about sort of the repatriation of remains and other objects that were plundered during colonialism. With that, how I enter that conversation is not only to think about remains as we popularly understand them, as sort of human remains like hair, tissue, bones, but I come with a performance studies perspective that is encouraging us to understand, to also to think of remains beyond what is tangible and what can be evidenced visually. So when we expand our understanding of what remains are, then we are able to think about immaterial remains. And this for me is where performance comes in, due to its nature. And its capacity to disappear and or remain. And so my work is about is about asking the question about performance, that if performance does remain, as performance studies scholars have argued, then how do we, scholars who are interested in remains, sit with performance remains, what emerges there, especially since performance can be so transient, but leaving remains. And finally, what I will say is about how the conversation about the ethics of looking or the ethics of spectacle largely focus on also very legible spectacles of death, like the black body that is out in the streets, which is, that spectacle is how we attend to that question. And I'm interested in something that is, for me, is just as devastating, which is the spectacle of Black joy and the spectacle, the spectacle of Black joy and jubilation, which actually solicits the same kind of destructive pleasures in terms of when we look. And I think that these spectacles of joy and amusement and jubilance are just as violent, are just as destructive. They are a meeting point of pleasure and destruction. And so to answer that question, I would say that I'm also trying to think about what death or the spectacle of death is, as it is traditionally understood, but also as how it manifests in these kind of different or atypical ways that present themselves as care or joy or jubilance, that I find to be just as destructive and deleterious.
Thank you all. That was a really interesting discussion. We have a couple questions. I can't believe how quickly the time is running, so I think we're going to move over to some of the questions in the Q&A. And the first one I have from Natalia Vargas Marquez, and she asks, how does art historical research, in particular, I'm thinking about the tools of visual analysis, and I think here we can say more than just art historical research, but something like visual studies or even performance studies, anything when you're, any sort of research where you're engaging with the visual. How does that kind of research confront the issues of the consent that several of you have mentioned, as well as the use of remains? Oh, I'm sorry, the question just disappeared.
I think you can see it if you go to the answered tab.
Yep, I got it. So I'm sorry, okay, so confront the issues of consent that several of you have mentioned, as well as the use of remains or depictions of dead bodies as objects of study, keeping into consideration as well the power dynamics of what bodies are exhibited or described and in what ways. And I'll leave that open, whoever would like to start.
Well, maybe I'll start by saying that I think part of what a kind of visual studies analysis approach can help us do is on one hand, understand the work that images and representations do in terms of the social meanings that they convey, the kind of way that they may compel belief, or as several of you mentioned, kind of urge a viewer to action, for example, that they're meant to have effects, right, on the viewer. And, you know, I think one thing that we can do by paying kind of close attention to their function as objects of communication, objects of exchange, objects of kind of negotiated meaning, is understand more about both what kinds of meanings are intended to be conveyed, but then also, of course, how that can run up against the needs, the interests, the desires of those doing the looking. And so to kind of pick apart a little bit the power dynamics that are happening around the object, which obviously in my case is human remains, I think is an important part of trying to begin to think about what we mean by consent. So as I mentioned earlier, in a 19th century context, this is not in the records. There aren't accounts of how organs, for example, are taken from patients, or how they end up in particular collections. What is recorded are case studies. And so this kind of reduces those bodily remains to evidence of disease, or to evidence of a structure or a system, and separates them from the idea of personal identity. And I think if we take some of those, in a sense, quite traditional tools of maybe something like art history, and we think about provenance research or ways of tracking the movement of objects, I think it starts to reveal how power is deeply embedded in this process of sourcing remains. In the case of what I'm looking at, prior to the 1830s in the UK, these remains might have come from executed criminals. But after the 1832 Anatomy Act, and in the US starting in 1831 in Massachusetts, and then going state by state till the end of the 19th century, these specimens are sourced instead from a kind of government regulated supply of bodies from hospitals, prisons, workhouses, asylums, bodies that are unclaimed, often because family members couldn't afford to bury deceased relatives. And then these unclaimed bodies become, in effect, property of the state, and are distributed to medical schools for use in dissection, and then end up eventually, in some cases, as specimens more permanently displayed. So I think it's about thinking of the kind of effective dimensions of these objects and images, but it's also about thinking circulation, the ethics of production and of making, the ethics of display, but then also considering the power dynamics that kind of underwrite each stage of that. And I want to just add that I think this is especially important, and much work remains to be done here in the US in this regard. Dana Ramey Berry has done fascinating work tracking the cadaver trade in the United States, both before the Civil War and after the end of enslavement, and thinking about how the bodies of enslaved African Americans continued to be commodified and made economic bearers of meaning even after death. What hasn't been written, and maybe can never be written, is how parts of those individuals, their bodies, their remains, also ended up on permanent display and continue to be potentially exhibited today. I don't know if we have that documentation. I don't know if it's out there because, again, the consent as we know it didn't exist. But I think it's a history that remains to be written. I'll stop there.
Maybe I can share something. So in terms of the consent, I agree with Jessica. So the definition of the consent is very important. So it depends on how you define it, where, when, how, and for whom. And also, I think who is supposed to give the consent to whom is another very key question. Usually we assume the image maker needs a consent from the subject who is being displayed, right? But in some cases, this might not be enough. Consent has to do with, the whole process, or what we call a visual economy as a whole. And also the power relationship is very much different in different part of the so-called economy. In my own case, I would say a lot of materials I'm dealing with belong to the category of unidentifiable materials, images, which means, maybe some of you have heard about orphan film as a term, which refer to a large body of footage that is outside of the mainstream commercial circuit of film industry, and which includes just any kind of image, which means, something from internet, something in the community text, something your personal note, something in your family historical collection, photographs, slides, postcards. So I was referring to orphan images by borrowing the term orphan film. So I would say in many cases, it's impossible for me to identify who the copyright holder is and who the consent giver is supposed to be. But I have to say it's a matter of self-positioning as well. I really need to be very aware of my privileged position as someone in academia and who holds access to a lot of archive materials, image materials, which cannot be easily categorized. So whenever I hold access and I hold the right to display or to show in different contexts, that's why I have to put a trigger warning, and I have to put a, something like consent in my mind, while I'm not able to be someone who asks for the consent from the impossible copyright holder. But in another sense, I think it's also important to recognize circulation as a historical construction as well. It's not just natural. And we have to see when we mention a certain kind of circulation, we are already referring to a specific context. And we have to be realized it also depends on how we define the circulation or distribution in the very historical specific period. And sometimes when I mention like the belated exposure of certain photographs from the Maoist period, for example, produced during the Cultural Revolution, there were a lot of images of death or corpse in red guard publications, which were popular during that time. People could see that on a daily basis, but it was not very accessible before what we call the digital age. So due to the access through the internet, people actually are getting more higher chances to see those images. And the issue of consent would be something more tricky and slippery because of the digital technology, the working of those digital media. So I think we really have to think about consent as something at the core of our ethical inquiry. And when we define circulation, I would say a book which is titled like a shadow economy of cinema might be helpful. Maybe we really need to think about the shadow economy of any kind of images, really not just through the official assigned textbooks or the official release films, through some illegal ways, informal economy of the images, we might get more space to explore how we locate the meaning of the consent in different ways. Thank you.
Well, we're very quickly running out of time, but I think we might be able to squeeze in one more response from our panelists to that question, if anybody wants to add a quick tidbit.
This is going to be extremely brief. I write about the circulation of Sarah Bachman's corporeal and performance remains over the course of more than a century. I also write about South African anti-apartheid activist and political philosopher Steve Biko, specifically artists, painters, and sculptors who produced work specifically in relation to Steve Biko's corpse. So that's what I write about, which means that the question of consent is, these are not subjects of consent at all. That's what I'd say. And I think that there remains being this malleable, or what's idea Hartman calls fungibility, speaks to exactly why the question of consent is one that is not even a factor for these Black people that I'm interested in. And lastly, and I don't know if this is too out of the, with Steve Biko, I'm very interested in also archival access because there were autopsy photographs after Biko was murdered by the South African apartheid government. And when making sort of creative work, painting, whatever, some artists, specifically white artists, had archival access, had access to these autopsy photographs in the way that Black artists like Sentleng Etwa and Ezra Mlachai did not. So that also should tell us something, and I'll just end there.
All right, so we have a lot more to talk about apparently, but unfortunately we've reached the end of our time. So I would like to thank everybody for tuning in today. I encourage you to send any questions to the Collective for Radical Death Studies, and we'll try to communicate those to our panelists so that they can get back to you if you have lingering questions. And thank you, of course, to all of our panelists for joining along here and speaking so eloquently about the work that they're doing on visual culture and death.